Don't drink that, sir. The voice was small, almost lost beneath the sound of the string quartet playing somewhere on the far side of the ballroom, but it landed in Edward Whitfield's ear with the precision of a thrown stone. He had already lifted the crystal flute halfway to his mouth. The pale amber liquid inside caught the light of the chandelier above him and threw small, bright shapes onto the back of his hand. He did not lower the glass right away. He simply stopped, his arms suspended in that strange and unnatural pose a man assumes when he has been interrupted in the middle of a motion he has performed 1,000 times without thinking. He looked down. Standing at his elbow was a boy, perhaps 11 years old, dressed in a black server's vest that was slightly too large in the shoulders and a white shirt with a collar that had been buttoned all the way up. The boy was holding an empty silver tray flat against his side. His other hand was at his hip. His eyes, dark brown and very steady, were fixed not on Edward's face but on the glass in Edward's hand. "What did you say?" Edward asked. He kept his voice low, the way he had learned to speak in negotiations when something unexpected had just entered the room and he did not yet want anyone else to know. "Don't drink that, sir," the boy repeated. "Please, sir, just put it back on a tray, any tray. Don't set it down on the table. Don't let anyone see you put it down." Edward Whitfield was 62 years old. He had built his shipping conglomerate from a single freight contract in the port of Charleston into a fleet of vessels that moved a quarter of the cargo on the eastern seaboard. He had stood in rooms with senators and admirals and the heads of foreign banks. He had been threatened in writing, threatened by phone, threatened once in person by a man with a gun in a parking garage in Houston. None of it had ever truly reached him. He had built a particular kind of life around the discipline of not reacting. He prided himself on the smallness of his expressions, the unhurried pace of his decisions, the way his face revealed nothing he had not already chosen to reveal. But this boy had stopped him cold. The ballroom of the Carrington Hotel was warm with the steady murmur of 300 guests. The Whitfield Foundation's annual gala raised somewhere between $6 and $8 million every November for pediatric research, and tonight was no different. Women in long dresses moved between conversations like fish in a slow current. Men in dark jackets nodded at one another with the half-attentive politeness of people who had learned to count the value of a room. The mayor was somewhere near the entrance. 2 senators were near the bar. A film actress who had recently donated $500,000 was standing by one of the tall flower arrangements, laughing too loudly at something a young man had said. Edward had been about to drink a small toast to himself in private. The check had cleared that afternoon. $8.1 million. The largest single-night total in the Foundation's history. Now he was looking at a boy with a server's vest and very serious eyes who had told him not to. "What's your name, son?" "Malik, sir, Malik Bennett." "Are you working tonight, Malik?" "My uncle works for the catering company. He brought me on for the dish run. I'm not supposed to be on the floor." "Then why are you?" The boy hesitated for the smallest possible second. Then his eyes shifted, just briefly, just enough, toward a place across the ballroom near the kitchen door. Edward did not turn his head. He had learned long ago not to follow the eyes of a frightened person too quickly. Whatever was being watched for a reason, and revealing that you had noticed was almost always a mistake. "Because I saw a man do something to that glass before they brought it to you," Malik said quietly. "And I wasn't sure at first, so I followed the tray. I followed it from the bar all the way across the room. The waiter who brought it to you didn't know. He just took whatever was at the end of the line. But the man who did the thing knew which tray was going to you because he watched the waiter pick it up. And then he walked the other way." Edward Whitfield felt, for the first time in a very long time, the strange and unwelcome sensation of his own heartbeat suddenly arriving in places where it did not usually announce itself. In his throat, in the tips of his fingers, in the small space between his shoulder blades. He did not move the glass. "Keep looking at me," Edward said, his voice calm and ordinary, the same voice he might have used to comment on the music. "Smile a little, pretend I just said something polite about the food." Malik did. The smile did not reach his eyes, but his mouth moved in the careful way of a boy who had been raised to be exactly as visible as the moment required, and not one shade more. Edward had seen that smile before. He had seen it on the faces of waiters in a dozen cities. He had seen it on the face of the young man who had cleaned his office at 6 o'clock every morning for 9 years. He had never until this moment understood what it was for. He lowered the glass slowly, but he did not set it down. He turned it in his fingers as if he were admiring the color, and he began to walk, not quickly, toward the long table along the eastern wall where 2 servers stood behind a row of empty trays. "Walk with me," he said quietly. 3 steps behind. If anyone stops me, you keep walking, take this tray." He nodded at one of the empty silver platters as he reached the table. Put it on your arm. When I pass you, I will set my glass on it without looking. You take it back to the kitchen. You do not stop. You do not let anyone else touch it. You give it directly to your uncle. Tell him I asked him to hold it somewhere safe until I come for it. Can you do that? Yes, sir. And then I want you to stay in the kitchen until I find you. Do not come back out on the floor tonight no matter who tells you to. If someone asks why, you say you broke a glass and your uncle told you to clean up. Understand? Yes, sir. Edward took 2 more steps, picked up a fresh empty glass from a row that had been set out for late arrivals, and then continued his slow walk along the table as if he had merely been searching for a cleaner flute. Malik picked up the silver tray, balanced it on his forearm in the practiced way of a boy who had been watching his uncle do it for years, and fell in 3 steps behind him. They moved across the corner of the ballroom. A woman in a navy dress smiled at Edward and lifted her own glass in a small private toast. He smiled back the way he had been smiling back at strangers for 40 years. He did not break his pace. He passed Malik without looking at him. He felt the small, light weight of the crystal flute leaving his hand and settling onto the tray, and he kept walking. Behind him, Malik turned smoothly and disappeared through the kitchen door. Edward did not stop. He continued along the table until he reached the far end, where a tall arrangement of white lilies blocked the view from the center of the room. He stepped behind it. He took out his phone. He did not call his security chief. He did not call the police. He called a number that was saved in his favorites under a single initial. The line rang once. Edward. Conrad, I need you in the hotel within 15 minutes. East lobby. Use the service entrance. Do not come into the ballroom. Bring whoever you have on the team tonight. Bring whoever is closest. Conrad Hale had been the head of Whitfield Logistics Internal Security for 11 years. Before that, he had spent 18 years with a federal agency that Edward had been told the name of exactly once. He had a particular gift for not asking questions in the first 30 seconds of a call, and he exercised it now. On my way, Conrad said. Are you hurt? No, but I almost was. And I need you to assume that whatever is happening here tonight is not finished. Understood? Stay visible. Do not be alone. I won't. Edward ended the call and slipped the phone back into the inner pocket of his jacket. He stood behind the lilies for a few more seconds, breathing slowly, letting the quiet, ordinary sounds of the ballroom reach him again. The string quartet had moved into something gentler. Somewhere near the stage, a woman laughed at a joke. A waiter passed with a tray of small, dark canapés that Edward had eaten 3 of earlier without thinking, and now could not stop thinking about. He stepped back out from behind the flowers. He smiled at no one in particular. He walked toward the center of the room with the empty replacement flute in his hand. The way a man walks when he has decided that the safest thing he can do is to be seen by everyone who might be looking for him. He did not yet know which man across the ballroom had watched the tray, but he had decided already that he would find him before the night was over. The first rule Edward Whitfield had ever taught himself in business was that a man who is being watched should never appear to be looking. He had used the principle 100 times across boardroom tables and on factory floors, and at long dinners where the most important conversation in the room was happening in glances above the wineglasses. He used it now. He crossed the floor with the easy pace of a host who had no particular destination. He paused at a small group near the dessert table and let himself be drawn into 30 seconds of conversation with a woman who ran a private foundation in Atlanta. He smiled at the right moments. He laughed once. He moved on. He stopped beside a state senator and exchanged a brief observation about the music. He moved again, and while he moved, he looked. Not at the people he was speaking to, but past them in the small reflective windows of the silverware, in the polished surface of a serving cart, in the dark glass of the tall French doors that led out to the terrace. He was looking for a man who was looking for him. He found him after almost 4 minutes. The man was standing near a pillar on the western side of the ballroom. He was holding a glass of sparkling water that he had not raised to his mouth once in the time Edward had been watching. He was wearing a dark blue jacket that was tailored slightly too well for a guest, and not at all the way a member of the catering staff would have been dressed. His hair was short and very neatly cut. His age was difficult to guess. Somewhere between 35 and 45. He had the kind of face that did not catch easily in a memory, and Edward recognized this not as an accident but as a discipline. The man was looking at the kitchen door. Edward turned his back on him without hurry and walked toward the small alcove off the main ballroom where the cloakroom had been set up. He stopped beside the table where a young woman was handing back coats. He pretended to look at his phone. He waited. After a minute and a half, his phone buzzed once. A single message from Conrad. East Service entrance, 2 minutes. Edward stepped out of the ballroom and into the carpeted hallway that ran behind the kitchens. The air here was different, cooler, quieter. The sounds of the gala receded behind him as if a door had been pulled half-closed in another room. He walked past 2 service carts and a stack of folded linens and turned the corner into a narrow corridor that led toward the east loading dock. Conrad Hale was already there. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with close-cropped gray hair and a face that had been weathered by something more demanding than time. He was dressed in a plain, dark suit and a plain, dark tie, the same way he dressed at the office, and the same way Edward had once seen him dressed to a wedding. Behind him stood 2 younger men in similar suits. They did not say anything when Edward approached. They simply moved to positions along the corridor where they could see both directions at once. "Talk to me," Conrad said. Edward told him. He told him quickly and in order. The boy at his elbow, the glass, the walk to the kitchen, the man by the pillar, the dark blue jacket, the sparkling water that had not been touched. He did not embellish. He did not speculate. He gave Conrad the facts in the same flat, clipped voice he used to deliver quarterly numbers in front of a board. Conrad listened. When Edward finished, he turned to one of the younger men. "Find the boy, quietly. Make sure he stays in the kitchen. Get the glass. I want it in a sealed container in my car within 5 minutes." The younger man nodded once and disappeared down the corridor. Conrad turned back to Edward. "And the man by the pillar? Still there a minute ago." Dark blue jacket, short hair, mid-30s, possibly older, he was watching the kitchen door. "Could he have seen the boy come back out?" "The boy didn't come back out. I told him not to." "Then he knows something is wrong." "Yes," Conrad considered this. He glanced at the second younger man. "Get back into the ballroom. Find him. Do not approach. I want to know where he goes and who he speaks to. If he leaves, I want him followed." The second man moved past them and threw the door back into the warm noise of the gala. Conrad looked at Edward. "Who knew you were drinking tonight?" Edward almost laughed. "Everyone in there knew I would be. I always do." "Then we start with everyone who knew you would be reaching for that particular glass at that particular time." Edward thought about the question while they walked. The corridor opened into a wider hallway behind the kitchens, and from there into a small staff break room that smelled faintly of coffee and dish soap. Conrad gestured him inside. The room had 2 plastic chairs, a folding table, and a humming refrigerator in the corner. It was the kind of room Edward had not stood inside in perhaps 30 years. Conrad closed the door. "Sit," he said. "Think." Edward sat. He set his hands flat on the table and looked at them for a long moment. They were steady, which surprised him a little. He had expected to find them shaking by now. "My private bar," he said finally. "The flutes were poured from a private bar on the north side of the ballroom, set up specifically for me and a small list of guests. The bottle is one I brought from my own cellar. It was an aged Armagnac, 2 glasses only for me to share with the foundation chair after the speeches." "Who knew about the bottle?" "My assistant, the catering coordinator." "The foundation chair, possibly her husband, the hotel sommelier who decanted it, that is everyone." "And the schedule, the exact time you would drink it?" "The toast was supposed to happen after the final donor was announced, roughly 9:45. I was a few minutes early. I had been about to drink it on my own before the formal moment. Habit. I like to taste a thing before I share it." Conrad nodded slowly. "So whoever set this up had access to that specific bottle, the specific schedule, and the specific assumption that you would be the one to lift the glass first. That narrows the room considerably." The door opened. The first younger man stepped inside, carrying a small black case the size of a hardcover book. He set it on the table. "The glass is sealed," he said. "I had the boy hand it to me directly." He did not let anyone else touch the tray from the moment he carried it off the floor. "And the boy? He is in the kitchen with his uncle. He is calm. He understands he should stay there." Conrad looked at Edward. "Bring him here." A minute later, Malik Bennett walked through the door in his slightly oversized vest and his too carefully buttoned shirt. He had been crying a little. The skin around his eyes was darker than it had been on the ballroom floor, but his mouth was still steady, and when he saw Edward sitting at the small folding table, his shoulders dropped half an inch in something that looked very much like relief. "Sit down, Malik," Edward said. "These men are with me. You can tell them what you told me, and then I want you to tell me a little more." Malik sat. He glanced once at Conrad and then back at Edward, and Edward saw in that small glance that the boy was making a decision about whom to trust. He was making it carefully. He was 11 years old, and he was making it the way a man twice his age would have made it. "I came up from the dish station," Malik said. "I wasn't supposed to, but my uncle had asked me to bring a clean stack of side plates to the cold prep station near the bar. I had the plates in my hands. I was walking around the long way because the short way goes through the main aisle and they don't like the dish boys cutting through there. So I came up along the back of the private bar, and that's when I saw him." "Saw who?" Conrad asked. The man in the dark blue jacket. He was standing on the staff side of the private bar behind the screen. He wasn't supposed to be there. There's a low panel that separates the guest side from the staff side, and he was crouched down a little, looking at the row of 2 glasses that were already poured and sitting on the small silver tray. Was anyone else at the bar? The sommelier had stepped away. I think he had gone to ask the catering coordinator about the timing. He was gone maybe 2 minutes. The bar was unattended. And what did the man do? Malik's eyes did not move from Edward's face. He took a small bottle out of his inside jacket pocket. It was a tiny bottle, like the size of a thumb. He unscrewed the top. He poured something into the glass on the left side of the tray. Then he put the cap back on and put the bottle back inside his jacket. And then he walked away. "The glass on the left," Edward said quietly. "How did you know that was the one for me?" "Because the sommelier had put a small folded card next to it that said your name." Edward closed his eyes for the briefest second. He had been a man who set down little folded cards with names on them for 40 years. He had never once thought of them as anything other than courtesies. He understood now in the same cold and distant way he had understood many things over the course of his career that a kindness made visible is also a target made visible, and that he had been making himself visible to anyone who cared to look for as long as he had been wealthy enough to be worth looking at. "You did the right thing, Malik," he said. "Every part of it. The watching, the following, the waiting. You did the right thing. I want you to remember that." Malik nodded once. He did not say anything. He had the patient expression of a boy who had been raised to be told what to do next rather than to be praised for what he had already done. Conrad opened the small black case on the table. Inside, nested in dark foam, was a sealed evidence pouch, and inside the pouch was the crystal flute, still half full of pale amber liquid. He did not take it out. He simply looked at it for a long second and then closed the case. "I have a friend at the State Crime Lab," he said quietly. "He will be at my house in 2 hours. We will know what is in this glass before sunrise. In the meantime," he turned to Edward, "the gala is not over. There are still almost 200 people in that room. The man in the dark blue jacket is still in there unless he has already left. And whoever sent him is almost certainly waiting somewhere for word that the job is done. Then he must hear that it is done." Conrad's eyes narrowed slightly. He understood. He had understood before Edward finished the sentence. "You want him to think the toast happened. I want him to think the toast happened and that I am fine. I want him to think his man failed. I want him to spend the next several hours believing the only mistake in the plan was a small one and that he can try again. Because the moment he believes the plan is exposed, he goes very quiet and we lose every thread that could lead back to him. And if there is a second attempt tonight, then we will be ready for it, and we will catch the second man as well." Conrad considered this. He looked at Malik, who was sitting very still in the plastic chair. He looked at the case on the table, then he nodded once. "All right," he said. "We do it that way, but you do not eat or drink anything else in that room tonight. Nothing, not a sip of water, not a single canapé. If anyone offers you anything at all, you take it, you hold it, you set it down somewhere it cannot follow you. Understood? Understood. And Malik stays here, with my second man at the door. He does not go back onto the floor under any circumstances." "Agreed." Conrad turned to the younger man. "Tell the team in the ballroom. The principal is going back in. Treat the room as compromised. 2 of you stay within 10 feet of him at all times. The man in the dark blue jacket is to be observed only. He is not to be approached or alarmed. If he attempts to leave the building, he is followed but not stopped. If he attempts to approach the principal again, then and only then you intercept." "Yes, sir." Edward stood up. He smoothed the front of his jacket. He looked at Malik once more. "I will come back for you when this evening is over," he said. "And then we are going to talk, you and I and your uncle. There are things I want to ask you, and there are things I want to offer you, and we will do all of that in the right order. But the first thing I want you to hear before I go back in there is this. You are not in trouble. You are not going to be in trouble. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. Not ever as far as I am concerned. Do you understand me?" Malik looked at him for a long moment, then he nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." Edward turned and walked out of the small break room. Conrad followed 2 steps behind him. The ballroom, when Edward stepped back into it, looked exactly the way he had left it. The string quartet had moved into a slow waltz. The chandeliers were still throwing their gentle light across the white tablecloths. A waiter passed with a tray of small glasses of something pink and sparkling. Edward smiled at him pleasantly and let him pass. He did not look toward the western pillar. He did not need to. He could feel the eyes on him. He walked the long way around the room first. He stopped at 3 tables. He shook hands with a federal judge who had come up from Washington for the evening. He listened to an architect describe a new wing she had been hired to design for a children's hospital in Savannah. He laughed at the right moments. He nodded at the right moments. He let the room see him, calm and unhurried and slightly distracted in the particular way of a man who has been the center of an evening for too many hours and is beginning to feel the small weight of it across his shoulders. He did not glance once toward the pillar. At 9:43, 2 minutes before the scheduled toast, the foundation chair, a woman named Patricia Lanier who had served on the board for 16 years, found him near the stage and touched his elbow. "Edward," she said, "are you ready? They are about to announce the final total." "I am ready, Patricia. Where is your glass? I told them to bring it to you a few minutes ago." "I already have it, dear. I picked it up myself on my way back from the cloakroom." "I wanted to taste it before we shared it." She laughed softly. "You always do that. You really do. It is the most ridiculous habit I have ever seen in a man who is supposed to be saving the world. It is my one indulgence." She squeezed his arm and stepped onto the small, raised platform. A microphone had been set up beside a tall arrangement of white roses. The room began to quiet without being asked to, in the gentle way that rooms quiet themselves at galas when the guests have been trained by long evenings to notice the moment without needing to be told. Edward stepped up beside her. He was holding the replacement flute he had picked up from the side table almost an hour earlier. It was empty. From across the room, with the chandeliers above it and the candlelight on the tables below, the pale gold of the wood-paneled wall behind him reflected through the empty glass in a way that almost looked like liquid. He had counted on this. He had stood at enough podiums in his life to know exactly what the eye would supply when the mind was already telling it what to see. Patricia spoke for almost 3 minutes. She thanked the donors. She thanked the staff. She announced the final total. There were soft, polite cheers around the room. She turned to Edward and raised her own glass. Edward raised his. He lifted it slowly to his mouth. He tilted it. He held it there for the length of a swallow. He lowered it. He smiled. The room applauded. He did not look at the western pillar, but two of Conrad's men did. And one of them, the man Conrad had sent into the ballroom earlier, watched with very careful attention as the man in the dark blue jacket lowered his own glass of sparkling water for the first time all evening and brought it slowly to his mouth and drank. It was the small private toast of a man who believed the work was done. Edward stepped down from the platform. The string quartet resumed. A waiter approached with a tray of champagne flutes. Edward smiled and waved him gently away. He walked toward the side of the room where his oldest friends were gathered, the cluster of men and women who had known him for 30 years, who had been at his first wedding and his second, and at the small private ceremony for his daughter's graduation from law school 4 years ago. He stood among them. He let himself be drawn into a story about a sailing trip in Maine. He laughed at the punchline. He sipped from his empty glass twice more in the next 10 minutes, holding it to his lips for the length of a swallow each time, and no one noticed. At 10:15, Conrad's second man, the one who had been watching the pillar, drifted slowly past Edward and let a single quiet sentence fall as he passed. "He left through the south doors. We are with him." Edward did not turn his head. He did not change his expression. He raised his empty glass one more time, smiled at a story he had not been listening to, and continued the conversation as if nothing in the world had happened. At 10:30, he excused himself politely from the group. He walked unhurriedly toward the cloakroom. He retrieved his coat. He walked out through the front lobby of the Carrington Hotel, smiled at the doorman, and stepped into the cool November air. A car was waiting at the curb. It was not the one he had arrived in. It was Conrad's. He got in. The car pulled away from the curb and turned east. Conrad was already in the back seat. He had taken off his suit jacket and hung it on the hook beside the rear window, and he was looking at a small tablet screen with the focused stillness of a man reading something he had been waiting to read for several hours. "They followed him to a hotel on Tremont," he said without looking up. "Not this one. A smaller place, 3 stars. He checked in 2 nights ago under the name Daniel Rourke. The name does not match any of the identification he is currently carrying. He has been in the room for the past 12 minutes. He has not made a phone call from the hotel landline. He has not answered the phone in his room. He has, however, sent 2 text messages from a phone we believe is a burner. The messages went to a number that pinged a tower in the eastern suburbs roughly 30 minutes ago. We are still working on the location." Edward absorbed this. The car moved smoothly through the quiet streets. The driver, a woman Edward had never seen before, did not look back at them once. "And the glass? At my house in 20 minutes. My friend from the lab will be there within the hour. By midnight we will know what was in it. By 2 we will know how it was made. By morning we may know where it came from." "And the boy?" "Still in the kitchen with his uncle." "My second man is with them. They will leave when the catering staff leaves, sometime around 11:30. Then they go home in a car I have arranged for them. There will be a man on their street tonight and tomorrow. The boy is safe. Edward nodded slowly. He looked out the window. The streets of the city slid past, ordinary and familiar, and he thought about how strange it was that 2 hours ago he had been about to drink something that would have ended him, and that the world outside the windows of the car had no idea, and that this was probably true of every quiet, ordinary night in every city in the world, and that he had simply, until now, been one of the people on whose behalf it was true. Conrad. Yes. Who would want me dead? Conrad set the tablet on his knee. He looked at Edward in the dim light of the back seat. He did not answer right away. He was a man who took the question seriously enough to consider it before he spoke. 3 categories of people, he said finally, and we will work through all of them tonight. The first category is business. You have made acquisitions in the past 3 years that have damaged people. The Reston merger, the coastal freight buyout, the dispute with the Sherwood family over the Southern Port concession. Any of those could produce a man who would pay enough money to a man like the one in the dark blue jacket. Yes. The second category is personal, family, inheritance, the structure of the trust, people who would be in a different financial position the day after you died. Edward thought about it. He had 2 children, both grown. His son ran a small foundation in Oregon and had refused to take a salary from the family company for 9 years. His daughter was a partner at a corporate law firm in Boston. Neither of them, he believed, with the careful and tested belief of a father who had been watching them since they were small, would have any part in something like this. But the trust was large. The trust touched many people. There were cousins. There was a nephew who had asked him for money 4 times in the past 2 years. There was an ex-wife, his first, who had not spoken to him in 11 years and who had reasons to dislike him that he had long ago accepted as fair. Yes, he said again, slower this time. There is the second category. The third category is political. You are not a politician, but you fund things. You have funded a particular candidate for the past 3 election cycles. You have funded a particular kind of journalism. You have funded a foundation that has, in the past 2 years, published research that has cost certain industries a great deal of money. Edward nodded. He had known this conversation was coming from the moment he had stepped into the car. He had been having a version of it with himself in the back of his mind since the boy had touched his elbow at the gala. Start with all 3, he said. Do not wait. Do not prioritize. I want every name on every list within 48 hours. Already in motion. And Conrad, yes. Whoever it is, when we find him, I want to meet him. Conrad looked at him for a long moment, then he nodded once. You will, he said. When the time is right, you will. They drove for another 15 minutes through the quieter streets east of the river, and Conrad's house, when they reached it, was not a house Edward had ever visited before. It was a low brick building set back from the road behind a row of bare oak trees, with a long gravel drive and a single light burning above the front door. Conrad had bought it 9 years ago. Edward had signed off on the financing without ever asking to see it. He understood now, as the car pulled up to the entrance, that the absence of memorable features was very much the point. A man Edward did not recognize was already waiting in the kitchen. He was perhaps 50 years old, with a long, calm face and the kind of slow, precise hands that come from a lifetime of working with things small enough to be ruined by impatience. He had set up a small, portable case of equipment on the counter beside the sink. The sealed evidence pouch with the crystal flute was already on the cutting board. Edward, Conrad said, this is Dr. Howell. He has worked with me on a number of matters. He does not exist tonight. Whatever he tells us we will use, but you will not see his name in any report you ever receive. Dr. Howell nodded politely at Edward and did not offer his hand. His hands were already gloved. I will be ready to tell you something useful in about 40 minutes, he said. There is coffee in the pot. Make yourselves comfortable. Edward sat at the small kitchen table. Conrad poured 2 cups of coffee. The clock above the stove read 11:17. Somewhere in the back of the house, a heating unit clicked on and began to hum. Conrad sat down across from him. He set his tablet on the table between them and turned it so that Edward could see the screen. While we wait, he said, I want to walk you through what we already know about the man in the dark blue jacket. The screen showed a photograph that had been taken with a long lens through the glass doors of the ballroom. The man was visible from the shoulders up. His face was caught in 3/4 profile, and even in the slightly grainy image, the discipline of it was apparent. He looked like a man who had been photographed many times without his knowledge and had long ago trained himself to give the camera almost nothing. Our facial recognition picked him up in less than 4 minutes, Conrad said. He is a former government employee. He left the service 9 years ago. Since then he has worked privately under at least 4 different names. The name on the hotel registration tonight, Daniel Rourke, is one of those names. His real name is Bennett Mercer. He is 43 years old. He was born in Ohio. He is very expensive. He does not take small jobs. He does not take political jobs. He works exclusively for private clients with private motives, and he charges in the neighborhood of $300,000 for a single contract. Edward stared at the photograph. He felt a small, cold pressure begin to gather behind his eyes. 300,000, he repeated. Yes. Then whoever sent him has the money and is willing to spend it, which removes a great deal of the first category. It removes most of the first category, yes. A business rival angry about a merger does not pay $300,000 for a poisoning at a charity gala. They pay lawyers, they pay lobbyists, they pay senators. The fact that someone reached for Bennett Mercer tells us a great deal about what they actually wanted. And what did they actually want? Conrad looked at him for a long moment. They wanted a death that did not look like a murder, he said. Mercer does not work in ways that leave fingerprints. He works in ways that leave coroners writing the word natural in the wrong box. A heart attack at a charity gala in a man your age would not have triggered an investigation. There would have been an obituary, there would have been a memorial service, there would have been the slow, ordinary settlement of an estate. That is what they paid for, that is what they wanted. The estate. Yes, then it is the second category. Almost certainly. Edward closed his eyes. He thought about his son in Oregon. He thought about his daughter in Boston. He thought about his nephew who had asked him for money 4 times. He thought about the ex-wife who had not spoken to him in 11 years. He thought with a small and unwelcome reluctance about Patricia Lanier who had touched his elbow at the gala and laughed at his ridiculous habits. He opened his eyes. "Show me the list," he said. Dr. Howell's voice came from the kitchen exactly 36 minutes later. "Edward, Conrad, I have what you need." They moved to the counter. Dr. Howell had laid out 3 small printed sheets beside his case. He was not a man who used words he did not need. "The compound is a synthetic cardiac glycoside," he said. "It is similar in structure to certain natural plant alkaloids, but it has been modified to defeat the standard toxicology panels that hospitals and medical examiners use as a first pass. At the dose I measured in the residue of this glass, it would have produced cardiac arrest within 40 to 70 minutes of ingestion. By the time anyone began to seriously investigate, it would have metabolized into compounds that look almost identical to the natural products of cardiac distress. A coroner who was not looking for it would not have found it. A coroner who was looking for it would have needed specialized equipment and a very specific reason to use it. "It is not something a man buys on the internet," Conrad said. "No, it is not. Where does it come from?" Dr. Howell hesitated. "There are perhaps 4 laboratories in the world that produce compounds in this family at this level of refinement. 3 of them are sanctioned research facilities. The 4th is a private contractor that operates out of a country that does not respond to extradition requests. If I had to guess, and you should not write down that I guessed anything, I would tell you that this compound came from the 4th one." Edward did not say anything for a long moment. He looked at the small sheets of paper on the counter. He looked at the empty crystal flute beside them. "How much would it cost," he asked quietly, "for a private buyer to obtain a dose like this?" "Roughly $200,000 for the compound itself, not including the cost of the person who delivers it. So the total cost of this evening, in the neighborhood of $500,000. Edward nodded slowly. He thanked Dr. Howell. He shook his hand for the first and only time. He walked back into the kitchen and sat down at the small table and put his face into his hands for almost a full minute. When he raised his head, Conrad was sitting across from him, waiting patiently. "Who in my family," Edward said, "has $500,000 to spend on this?" Conrad opened his tablet. He turned the screen toward Edward again. There was a new document on it now, a financial map that Conrad's team had begun assembling at midnight. Names were arranged in a circle around the central node of the Whitfield estate. Beside each name was a small column of figures. Most of the figures were modest. 2 of them were not. The first was Edward's nephew, Christopher Whitfield, age 34, who lived in a townhouse in Boston that he could not afford on his official income. The second was a woman named Eleanor Whitfield Cross, Edward's first wife, who had remarried 12 years ago and now lived on a horse farm in Virginia. "Both of them," Conrad said, "have access to funds well beyond what their public profiles suggest. Christopher has a trust that matures fully on your death. It contains approximately $42 million in restricted assets that he cannot currently touch. The trust language is unusual. It was drafted by your father in 1971, and you inherited the obligation when your father died. Christopher receives a small annuity from it now. He receives all of it the day after your funeral. And Eleanor? Eleanor's divorce settlement, signed 27 years ago, contains a survivor's clause that was deeply unfashionable even at the time. If you die before her, she receives a separate distribution from a holding company that you and your father set up before your first marriage. The distribution is roughly $19 million. She has not spoken to you in 11 years, but she has reviewed that clause through her attorneys 3 times in the past 18 months. Edward stared at the screen. Christopher and Alina have not spoken to each other in over 20 years, he said quietly. They cannot stand each other. They have not been seen in public together, Conrad corrected. That is a different thing. Edward looked up. Have they been seen in private together? Twice. Once at a small inn in Connecticut 6 months ago, once at a dinner in New York 3 weeks ago. The dinner was paid for by Christopher's credit card. The reservation was for 2. Edward set both hands flat on the table again. His hands, he noticed, were finally shaking, a small steady tremor that he could not control and did not try to. All right, he said softly. All right, then we do this properly. The next 3 days moved with the careful precision of a current that has chosen its course and will not be turned. Conrad's team did not sleep. Hannah Reyes, the same investigator who had once handled the most discreet matter Edward had ever asked of anyone, flew in from Atlanta and set up in a small office on the 2nd floor of Conrad's house. The crystal flute was sent under a new chain of custody to a federal lab through a federal prosecutor whom Edward had known for 20 years and trusted in the bone. Bennett Mercer, the man in the dark blue jacket, was followed without interruption. He did not leave the city. He appeared to be waiting, and while he waited, Christopher Whitfield made the mistake that every patient man eventually makes. He grew impatient. On the 3rd night at 10:15, he called Alina Whitfield Cross at her farmhouse in Virginia from a phone he believed had not been compromised. The call lasted 19 minutes. By the end of it, federal agents had warrants for both of them in 3 jurisdictions. Bennett Mercer was arrested at his hotel on Tremont without a struggle. Christopher was arrested at the door of his townhouse the following morning. Alina was arrested in the kitchen of her farmhouse with a cup of coffee still warm on the counter beside her. Edward did not attend any of the arrests. He stood at the window of his study and watched the late autumn light move slowly across the garden and thought about his father, who had drafted the trust language in 1971 with the steady belief that family was the thing in the world that could be relied upon when nothing else could. He did not feel rage. He had thought he would, but he did not. He felt instead a slow and very ordinary sadness, the sadness of a man who has spent 40 years building something and has only now understood which of the walls were load-bearing. The case took 14 months. Christopher pleaded out in the 8th month. Alina went to trial and was convicted on every count. Bennett Mercer, whose name Edward had been told once and chose never to speak again, was extradited to a federal facility where he would not see another open sky for the rest of his natural life. In the spring after the trials ended, Edward bought a small house on a quiet street near a good public school in the eastern part of the city. He bought it in the name of a trust that no one outside his lawyer's office knew about. He gave the keys to Tessa Bennett, Malik's mother, who had worked the dish line at the Carrington Hotel for 9 years and had not once in those 9 years been able to send her son to a school that did not require her to drive him for 40 minutes each way. Malik enrolled in the new school in September. Edward paid for it, and for the tutors, and for the summer programs, and for the cello lessons that Malik, to everyone's quiet surprise including his own, turned out to have a particular gift for. Edward did not call any of it a gift. He called it an investment in someone who had already proven what kind of person he would become. In late April of the year after the trial, almost 18 months after the gala, Edward walked into the small living room of the house on the quiet street and found Malik sitting on the floor with his cello between his knees and a book open on the rug beside him. He was 12 and a half now. He had grown almost 3 inches. Edward sat down on the couch. "Malik," he said, "do you ever still think about that night?" Malik looked up at him. He thought about the question. He was a boy who had learned a long time ago not to answer questions before he had thought about them. "Sometimes," he said. "Not often, mostly when I see a man in a dark blue jacket." "And what do you feel when you think about it?" Malik considered this carefully. "I feel like the world is bigger than I used to think it was, and I feel like that is a good thing mostly, because if it is bigger, then the small things matter more, not less." Edward looked at him for a long moment. "You are right about that," he said quietly. "You are right about exactly that. This story is a reminder that the most dangerous betrayals rarely come from strangers. They come from the names already written in the will, from the seats already reserved at the table, from the people who have been counting silently for longer than anyone realized. And it is a reminder that courage does not require size or status or wealth." A child with steady eyes and the will to whisper at the right moment can change the entire course of a powerful man's life. Pay attention to the small voices. Never look away from what you know is wrong. And never underestimate the difference one honest child can make.